Heaven or hell, duel one, let's rock!
Guilty Gear X2, the third game within the Guilty Gear series, and by far the most polished game they've ever made during its time of release. That even before I end up replaying this game, I still remembered a lot about it, from the game's branching story mode to the difficult challenges within the mission mode. Especially, I remember that every boss fight against Ino on the arcade mode, and man, it's one hell of an experience battling her. Again, as much as I love the game, it's already been years since I last played this one. I got some few experience replaying the previous series before, but this one was a huge challenge for me to accomplish 100% both on the story and the arcade mode of it. It took me a month to accomplish everything there, considering the time I had to take breaks in between, relaxing both of my thumbs from exhaustion. Before I move on to the main review of Guilty Gear X2, I wanted to talk about the different versions first, considering there's 6 different versions overall. Guilty Gear X2, Reload, Slash, Accent Core Plus, and Accent Core Plus R. The Accent Core versions, I consider them as a sequel to this game. New story, new sets of characters and stages, the different overall UI layout, and many other things. While the first Accent Core version doesn't have a story mode, it's kinda like what happened to Guilty Gear X before. So yeah, there's that. There's the other 2 remaining versions, Reload and Slash. Slash is automatically out, considering it was only released in Japan unfortunately. It's not like I could fully understand without any translation of it. Reload version on the other hand had a proper translation of the game, but it didn't have a wide release of the game on the PS2. There's also the Xbox version, but I kinda wanted to focus on the PS2 games instead. Despite I really love the rework for Robokai for that version, I think reviewing the first one would be the more authentic kind of way. There's also the Korean version of Reload, which has a decent different soundtrack overall, but that's for a different topic to talk about one day. This is K1PM. Today, I'll be doing a full review of Guilty Gear X2. I'll be going more in depth about the game and pointing out the pros and the cons of it.
Destroy! その手見どころはあるな。だいぶ様になってきたよ。
気が抜けないな。
Heaven or hell, let's rock!
Guilty Gear X2 was developed by Arc System Works, the same ones who developed these games that you might know, and was published 2 years after the release of their second game, Guilty Gear X. The full experience I had with the game are both amazed on how creative the improvements it has as a fighting game, and frustrated at the same time with the problems it has that it ends up creating for this one. Namely, the branching story mode of the game, and even the boss fights against Ino. But before I move on to that, I'll talk about a bit on the plot and story first, just to get a good scope of it. The plot of the game starts out 2 weeks after the events of Guilty Gear X Plus, where the events of the newly discovered gear known as Dizzy have already been resolved. Dizzy went on hiding with the Jellyfish Pirates with the help of a few different characters in the game. The rest of the world thought that Dizzy was already been taken care of, while Jam got the bounty in order to have her very own restaurant. As they go on with their own lives, 2 opposing groups were plotting behind the scenes, the Post-War Administration Bureau and the group of That Man. Ino, who's a servant of That Man, ends up creating conflicts for most of the characters, attacking the Jellyfish Pirates on their ship in order to target Dizzy, handing out the outdated bounty papers, and fighting against different characters around. While the Post-War Administration Bureau starts to make their own move, sending out a bunch of Robo-Kais around in order to abduct specific people to study on, and for unknown different reasons at this point in the game. Just like most fighting games, the story in the game are based on the character's perspective, having their own story to follow on with a single ending in the end on the game's arcade mode. But this game is a bit different when it comes to the story. Guilty Gear Plus and this game are probably the first ones to introduce this kind of story branching in a fighting game. Not only does it offer 3 different endings for each character, but some of it changes the scenario and events during the story. I can't recall any other old fighting games I've ever played that offers this kind of scenario, other than Soul Calibur 3, but on a much simpler take towards the ending alone. It's not exactly the same thing as this one. Going back to the story branching, depending on the player's action towards a story mode, it leads towards a different route of a character. Whether the player chooses to end a match quickly, do an instant kill move on a specific opponent, intentional continues, timeout win, or other certain conditions that should be met. Although there's one huge problem. There's no guide or even an indicator on which should be done in order to move on to a different route. Imagine trying to complete every ending in a game, guessing which one of these is the conditions that would lead you to a different path, while having that annoying prerequisites of other characters ending first, before unlocking the other routes of other characters. And you know what? It's a nightmare how this plays out. The only way to unlock every ending in a game is to have a proper guide online to look it up. GameFAQs was the only complete reliable source to look it up back then, and without it, anyone would be fucked at that point. It's such a shame they have this kind of problem. The game have already been building a proper background and lore for the series, and because of this problem, most players couldn't fully understand or even appreciate it. Aside from that, when it comes to the quality on the story itself, it's pretty much alright for a fighting game story, as it feels a lot like a visual novel game, but on a much more shorter scale, having most of the characters encounter to happen just in a slightly different scenario in between, basing on the player's action in a fight instead of having the option to choose. I love how clever the game's story can be, taking advantage of a fighting game setting to add these kind of scripted events. Although not every scenario has the same thing, only a few certain parts of the story this actually happens, as well as having a decent voice cast for each of the character, from Ino's seductive voice lines
天国に行かせてあげる
to Faust's intimidating weird voices that in some scenario, he's slowly becoming Dr. Baldhead all over again.
血が止まらない
Although during these cutscenes, it kinda lacks a bit of atmosphere. It feels like it's kinda too silent in between without the music, not to mention how they keep reusing the same background stage in a battle, which it's not bad actually. It's just, it would have been better if they made a dedicated background for those scenarios, especially considering the developers have a huge set of gallery images waiting to be unlocked. They could have used their development time for that instead.
Please select your character.
Guilty Gear X2 finally has a wide range of decent characters, totaling up to 23 playable characters, 4 new ones with a unique sets of moves, and 3 unlockable returning characters from the previous series. I'm glad they returned Justice and Cliff in the game, with a much more balanced setup, but it's kinda sad how Justice is the only one having an ending out of the 3 characters, while Robokai on the other hand finally has a proper debut on the English translation of the game. Although Robokai is the enemy of the story, you could actually see a ton of them within the different characters' story, while most of its movesets are based on the previous version of Kai in Guilty Gear X. The other 4 new characters, Bridget, Ino, Slayer, and Zappa, they are actually a nice addition within the game. Although personally, I'm not that much of a fan for Ino with her sets of moves. But her boss battle is actually really interesting. Kinda reminds me of that boss fight against Vanilla Ice on the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure fighting game for the PS1. It's a bit unconventional, but somewhat works alright. Despite it kinda feels a bit cheaty that I can't hide behind her back, or even attack right in front of her every time she does her special. And if I did while the special is activated, I'd get a much heavier punishment out of it. It can be a bit ridiculous in a way if you'd see it this way. With some bit of practice in the end, it's actually manageable once I get used to the patterns. Bridget on the other hand is pretty much alright, a bit tricky to use at the start, taking advantage on the positioning of his attacks to corner the enemy off, while being really mobile with the amount of movesets he has. Zappa on the other hand can be a gamble to use on, with all 5 different spears behind his back. Summoning the other 3 spears based on a chance can be a risky move. Having their own sets of moves to memorize and adapting the kind of style to use them properly, utilizing Zappa can be quite difficult. but that's what makes him a challenging foe to fight against. Especially how you can easily confuse the enemy when using him. And with just enough hits on the enemy, you could summon this second strongest being that can obliterate the enemy. But of course, Esco or this spirit is still the strongest one. That destroy move in the end just shows it all. Now Slayer on the other hand is a straightforward character, focusing more on the striking with a moderate speed he has, while having a reliable set of attacks on his backward stance. When it comes to the overall scaling on the balancing of characters however, most of them are pretty much balanced in a way. It improved a bit compared to the previous series that I ended up reviewing before, having a diverse set of characters in terms of speed and power, while most characters having an interesting mechanic of their own. I've already finished all of the characters' arcade mode, achieved all of the endings on the story mode, and some other missions in the game, but I still find it lacking for some of the characters' movesets, especially if you'd look at it this way, how some of the characters just feels unfair to choose on. There's also a lot of the characters' extra movesets being shown within the story mode, but it's not available for the player to pull off unfortunately. A part of it is due to the cinematic feel towards the story, which is pretty much understandable, but at least some of the moves are available on the EX mode of a character. EX mode provides different sets of moves for the chosen character, which I think it's still balanced in a way, just in a different form of playstyle. Although I wish the devs themselves just added this whole thing as a default for every character instead. It would have been better in my opinion. There's another mode when selecting a character, the SP mode. This enables the player to choose either the gold or shadow version of a character. The shadow version ends up granting infinite tension level for the player to spam a bunch of specials around, while the gold version has a ridiculous scaling of power, boosting the character's damage in an absurd amount. Think of it as a fun mode just to mess around with the game.
Heaven or hell? Let's rock!
As some of you might know, Guilty Gear series is rather different compared to the other fighting games. Aside from the obvious fast playstyle and some complicated movesets to pull off, there are 3 unique game mechanics that are within the game. The first one is the destroy ability or instant kill move. At any given time in a battle, pressing all of the 4 attack buttons at the same time, then doing this combination, it unleashes an instant kill ability on the enemy. But of course, it comes with a cost when trying to pull it off. Not only does it drain your tension gauge or your health slowly, it'll end up removing your tension gauge completely, disabling any special move to use for that round. It's already hard enough to land a proper destroy ability when it can easily be blocked, having to anticipate the enemy's opening while being worried at that state, as it can actually drain your health that fast when your tension gauge is fully drained. Then there's a special case with Mei and Dizzy. Mei being the only one having a slightly harder destroy move, while being unblockable as her destroy move is actually in a form of a grab, instead of a strike kind of thing. While Dizzy on the other hand doesn't have an instant kill move unfortunately, at least she has one of the strongest specials in the game, but it's a bit costly when using it in a battle. The second one is a burst mechanic. It's a quick escape when getting beaten up by the enemy's attacks, but it can't be used while being hit with a special move in order to balance things out. The third one is the Roman cancel. While performing any attacks, then pressing any of the 3 attack buttons at the same time, it cancels out the ongoing attack animation in order to freely move after it. It's best used when extending a certain combo or feinting an attack to confuse the enemy. Although it comes with a cost of 50% of the tension gauge of the player, those 3 mechanics are actually the integral parts of the series, the defining features of Guilty Gear that absolutely works well in my book. In Guilty Gear X2, there are different game modes to choose from. The usual ones are the arcade, versus, practice, story, and survival mode. You know, the common ones that's usually seen in a fighting game. And there's the other 2 unique modes, Mission and Medal of Millionaire. Mission mode is a selection of different challenges, battling different enemies on certain special conditions. That's absurdly really hard. Not only does it give a very unfair disadvantage, it'll test your limits on how far you could actually go. If you think you're that good at a fighting game, these challenges gonna beat you up. As for me, I give up. It's damn too hard to complete everything there. I'm already happy completing every character's arcade and story mode. The other mode is Medal of Millionaire. It's somewhat like a survival mode, but instead of battling enemies to increase the level of the stage, this one offers a more aggressive kind of play. Attacking the enemy constantly gives out these medals for the score to be higher. There's even at times that gives HP health by a small percent. It's basically just encouraging the player to rush things in a battle. Aside from those modes, I actually like the improvements on the training mode they've done. They've learned a lot from their past mistakes of it. Now, it's much more customizable than before, making it easier to practice.
あなたに捕まえられる？行くよ！
Heaven or hell? Final! Let's rock!
One of the game's remarkable feature is its astonishing art design throughout the whole game. Not only did each of the characters' design and animation looks amazing, but how the overall stages and UI design have improved quite a lot compared to before. I love how each of the characters are designed in a very diverse set. The level of creativity and the quality of every character, what makes the series stands out absolutely well within the fighting game genre. Even with the new characters released for this game, they still absolutely nailed it. Not to mention, there's the old stages that were reused but was improved greatly on. They didn't just added new effects into the mix, but changed a lot of its design into a much more better one, especially the stages with May's ship. These kinds of little hints and details what makes me appreciate the game even more. When it comes to the overall soundtracks of the game, Guilty Gear X2 has that blend of rock music with a mixture of a unique defining theme, depending on the character's style and personality. From Milia and Kai's sense of majestic theme, to May's and Bridget's vibrant adventurous music, the game even has a more oriental aesthetic for Jam's theme. Even with the new character's theme, I still find it really good to listen on. The blending of different genres of music would makes it distinct and refreshing to hear. I'm actually even surprised how there's a variant version of Kai's theme that matches with Robo-Kai's getup, being an imitation of Kai himself. It's distorted, yet a bit chilling to hear it again in the game. It completely sets the mood on a special unique kind of fight in the story mode. Goes to show how Daisuke Ishiwatari's works is still an amazing piece to listen on even until this day. A unique specialty of his that hits differently for each one he's done.
もう寝てるなんて緊張感ないですよ。
Heaven or hell? You won! Let's rock!
That's why I give this game a rating of 8.8 out of 10. Guilty Gear X2 has always been a standout for me as one of my top favorites for a reason on the PS2. Aside from its gorgeous design and amazing soundtrack, the diverse set of characters and unique mechanics and styles of their own, what makes Guilty Gear X2 as one of the classics of 2D fighting games. Especially considering for a game made on 2002 and 2004 for the translation, the quality of it is still outstanding for its time. Even comparing to the other games on the PS2, it's still overall amazing. Not to mention, the story branching of a fighting game is unheard of before. Perhaps there might be a few games that has the same idea, but it's pretty much uncommon for sure. Although it's not perfect considering the problems it has with the conditions of the branching, Guilty Gear X2 is arguably the peak of 2D fighting game of its time, at least on the graphical side of things. Now, would I recommend you on playing the game? I highly suggest just go for the Accent Core plus R version on the Steam instead. That is, if you're looking for a complete gameplay experience of it. As for the story, I suggest just look it up online instead. Or you could actually just watch it on one of my videos on the complete story of the game, if you're that curious. I even end up putting the complete timeline of it all in there. So yeah, you might want to check that out. For more videos such as these, why not head down to my channel to check things out? I do accurate game reviews of the past games, and some other new ones too. If you want to support my channel, a subscribe would be really helpful. It kinda helps me out morally, to be honest. This is K1PM, and I bid you farewell.